So I think we've now actually just clocked into the afternoon. So good afternoon, excellencies, to all our partners from NDAs, accredited entities, delivery partners, as well as the many GCF colleagues here. I think we're going to move straight into the next session and hopefully keep momentum rolling to get you to lunch on time. My name is Selena Reiter. I'm the head of policy and strategy here at the GCF Secretariat. And with my colleague Ramona, who's hiding off just to the side for the time being, we're going to facilitate this next session on how to deliver a paradigm shift, GCF2 strategy and replenishment. And if we go to the next slide, this session will see a bit of a change of pace because we want to hear from you within this slot. So if we could move to the next slide, our control team up the back. What we're asking everyone to do for this session is actually log into the Menti app. You should now be familiar with it, the same app that was used in the previous session. And the login instructions should, if we can move to the next slide, come up on the screen soon. You'll see it www.menti.com with the access code. Thanks. So there it is there. Or you can just scan the QR code that you see on the screen. As we work through the presentation and the session, the prompts will come up for your input. And you can, of course, continue to use the Q&A function either on Wova or on Menti to provide feedback as we go through the session. So if we could, the instructions will also be saved in the Wova Q&A chat if you missed them on that slide just now. So yes, as you've heard from already colleagues this morning, you're joining us at quite a critical moment in the sense that we've just launched our second replenishment process. Our first programming, GCF1 programming period will end, as you know, in December of next year, 2023. And the GCF2 will cover the period 2024 to 2027. The board launched this process at our last board meeting in July, and it's scheduled to culminate in what hopefully will be a very successful pledging conference. And thank you to our colleagues from the GEF for the well wishes and the pep talk at the end of the last session there, but in September next year. At the same time, the board has initiated a review and update of our strategic plan. So a zero draft is actually in preparation for our next board meeting in October, and it's due to come together in the summer of next year. And that's why we would love to hear from all of you today. We've launched an open consultation process on this, and we'll be very much taking into account the feedback from this week's conferences as we develop that draft of the GCF strategy. And of course, our replenishments and our programming directions are designed to take into account your developing countries' stated ambitions, actions, and contributions to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. So if I can take a cue from our hashtag, this session is all about how we can inspire more climate action together. Just to give you a sense to the next slide, please, of how we're actually approaching our strategic planning process. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you'll see an overview there. Basically, we have various organizational building blocks or foundational pieces that we take our cues from, including our governing instrument, theory of change and business model. But what we're most interested in exploring today is the opportunities and the risks in the current landscape. So as we've already started the conversation on this morning, what lessons can we learn from what we've already done so far? What do we know about the current global investment context, about developing countries' needs and where the impact potential is? And then how do we better grasp an understanding of and capture our comparative advantage in that wider climate finance landscape? So that's what we're hoping to probe into a bit today. And to the next slide, please, to give you a sense of the structure of this session, we want to hear from you. We'll be doing this in 4 parts. Each part will, I think, run about, we'll aim for 15 minutes rather than 20 minutes because we're a bit behind. And we'll basically have a short presentation, introductory thoughts from my colleague Ramona, and then go to you for inputs via the Menti app. And you can see 4 broad themes there. First, in order to deliver your ambitions, help us understand what is GCF currently doing well and what can we do better? And the Honourable Minister from Belize, I think, shared some very frank but helpful thoughts on this already in the previous session, but we'd love to get all your views as well. Second, when we look at the global investment context and developing countries' needs, does our strategic vision remain relevant and ambitious? Third, understanding programming needs and opportunities. What programming goals should the GCF actually pursue in this next period? And then finally, understanding our comparative advantage. How can we strengthen complementarity and coherence? So with that structure, we'll be working through each part in turn. I'll hand over to my colleague, Ramona, to take through the opening thoughts for part one.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all. We will be playing a bit of hide and seek through this session, coming in and out as we move through the segments. So the first segment is looking at starting right from the top. What has GCF done well? What can it improve on? And that's what we'd like to hear your thoughts on. To give a bit of context on the overall GCF journey, especially those that have been with the fund for a very long time, you'll be familiar with the phrase building the plane while flying for the IRM period, where we started processing funds while setting up the institutional architecture at the same time, with GCF1 seeing a bit more of a mature approach to how we work with partners and how we allocate resources. It's been mentioned GCF's business model is to work through partners. It doesn't invest by itself. It works through its network of AEs based on a second level due diligence business model. And we've seen a shift from IRM through the GCF1, where we were allocating resources and doing investment planning on a case-by-case basis, sort of first come, first serve, into one that's a bit more focused into GCF1. And that's tied into the goals that each replenishment period has set for itself. And the opportunity into GCF2 is to build on this network of partners that's established already and act more as a convener and bringing partners along opportunities that have the greatest potential to deliver on impact for developing countries. And that's tied to some of the questions we hope to assess with you today, which is what particular changes should actually be done into GCF2 to strengthen and integrate the strategic planning model. Colleagues in the previous sessions have already given a sense of what achievements GCF can be proud of in the first two replenishment periods, including the amount of funding it has allocated. Especially GCF1 has seen an increased amount of funding going to adaptation, including to the private sector, increased amount of funding through direct access entities, as well as a significant portfolio under implementation and new practices being put in place to support portfolio implementation management. Lastly, quite a bit of effort has been taken over the last few years on codifying all processes and helping to align both GCF internally, but partners externally around what is required to actually access GCF resources. We're obviously conscious that the picture is not always rosy, that there are areas that require a bit more attention. And the first would be, how is GCF programming predictable, and how does it align with the Paris cycles and the Paris ambition cycles that countries are subject to under the Paris Agreement? I think a second note we've heard from panelists before is that there's still a bit of gap from strategy setting and having an NDC or a NAP submitted to actually translating that into concrete investments, but also in strengthening the country ownership of that process. Currently, country ownership is manifested through a no objection letter, but there's a bit more room there to make sure that national partners are involved throughout the implementation planning process. Lastly, we're seeing a need to improve access. This may be a key word throughout the rest of the session. What does access mean, and what concrete steps can be taken to improve that, including through direct access entities? I hope that gives a bit of context on really taking the high level picture of GCF progress, but areas that we could look into. And I think with that, we'll turn over to you and pass over to Selina to moderate the questions for this segment.
Thanks so much, Ramona. So as you can see on the screen, it's time for your feedback. So we have 3 questions within this segment, part 1. If we could go to the first. So the first is pretty simple. What has GCF done well? What should it actually keep doing into GCF2? You'll have free text there. I think it's limited to 250 characters, but please take a few minutes and just share with us your thoughts on what is actually working and what we should continue doing into the GCF2 programming period. So thank you for the first entry there, reinforcing countries' capacities on climate finance. There is absolutely no rules around what you can put here, simply what's on the top of your mind. Done well. Share of DAE needs more support for DAEs. DMA, a shout out to you, advice on project ideas. Automation of portfolio management. Soon I'm going to have trouble keeping up, so get the ideas in quick and fast. Enhanced capacities for NDAs, leveraging private sector finance, getting noticeably faster and should keep getting faster still. There's a good call for action there. Readiness program. To our control team, I don't know if it's possible to actually scroll the Menti results. I should also mention, of course, that all of these inputs will be retained for later as well. We'll be looking through them all thoroughly as we prepare the updated strategic plan draft. So providing predictable climate finance to scale successful projects, a few references to private sector engagement there. Readiness program is a great initiative. TA consultant support in project concept development. Few themes around readiness, around capacity building for DAEs, strengthening country capacity. Multi-country projects, that's a different one. Mainstream the process of climate finance at national level. So keep it coming. It's great to hear about some of these successes and good to see some common themes coming through there. I think we might just be able to go to the next question. You can keep providing answers in this question and then simply click go to next slide or go to presenter slide when you're ready to come with us to the next question. So having reflected on what is working, the second thing we want to understand from you, and this is very important, we are a learning institution, is what can we actually do better? So what's perhaps not working so well? What can we improve on as we move into this next strategic programming period? I see accreditation support, fast track access, implementing EDA, simplified approval, simplification. Simplification, I think, came through as a key theme in that last word cloud in Juan's session as well. Accreditation process, simplify procedures, simplify access, post-accreditation support there, as well as the accreditation process. So obviously not just coming to accreditation, but the support to actually engage in programming. Prioritization for national DAEs needs to be fit for purpose for LDCs and SIDS. Thank you for that. More tailored to country vulnerabilities. As the 2DD allow for much greater flexibility during the implementation phase. I think that echoes some of the themes from the previous session. Provide AEs with responses, with delays along no answer is given. So for responsiveness there, how to support countries to keep experts in the government and not lose capacity. So both building, but also retaining that expertise we need to function as our investment ecosystem. Align talk with practice, walk the talk. Better understand country context. And of course, you being here is an important part of that. There's also, I think, consideration of developing a regional presence, which we know is important to help us come closer to the ground. And that, of course, the COVID pandemic hasn't been amenable to us being able to meet face to face and exchange on the ground over these last few years. Okay, so feel free to continue providing your input there. Fantastic set of rich inputs going in. We'll go to the third question, which is actually a ranking-based question. So I'm just going to introduce you first to the options, and then you'll be asked to put these in order of importance. So the question is, what would be the most significant step GCF could take to improve access to resources? We have a selection there, and then you can, of course, use the Q&A function of your chat to add any options you don't see on the screen. But the ones we have within the Menti are simpler templates, clearer guidance on how to prepare proposals, more technical assistance to actually help meet GCF requirements, more streamlined and consistent feedback from GCF, more predictability on the resources available to each country, less complex and better harmonized policies, and increased direct access. And I think we heard again a call for that from the Honourable Minister in the last session. So we'll go into the Menti app, and it will allow you to rank these in order of importance to you. I know this one's a little more complex to navigate, particularly if you're on a mobile device. It gives you all of the options as you go into it. And then as you go to option 2, option 3, option 4, it will actually eliminate some of those options to help you filter. But we can see some results coming through on the screen. For the moment, less complex, better harmonized policies is up there at number 1. Clearer guidance, more streamlined feedback seem to be edging up and down there together in the second and third places. We'll just give it another minute or so for people to be able to work through your responses. And again, just a reminder, if you feel there's something we've missed in this answer that's really important, please do pop it into the Q&A either on Menti. You can see a button, Q&A, and then open Q&A, ask new question. You can do it on the Menti app, or you can do it in Wova through the Q&A function. And I think even though they're moving around, we can see a trend there in terms of the top priority 3 or 4 actions for us to take away. So we'll continue to let you work on that set of Menti questions. That's the 3 for part 1. And I'll invite Ramona back to the stage to actually take us into the presentation and remarks for part 2, which is on the investment context and the GCF strategic vision. So back to you, Ramona.
Thank you very much. So I think now that we've gotten a bit of a sense of the big ideas on what works well, what doesn't go well, in this second part, we're actually starting to move a bit more into what is it that GCF can precisely do in GCF2 to support countries more, and how can it respond better to the investment context. Juan has touched on this in the previous session on what the latest global climate landscape is. I think the climate science and everyone in the room knows climate change is happening now and action needs to take place faster, but also in a different way, sort of moving from specific climate interventions to an actual systemic approach to climate planning and investment. We've seen the needs that developing countries have put forward. It goes up to 6 trillion, and a lot of the needs haven't even been costed yet. So a lot is still needed to translate that into concrete opportunities for investment, with many countries still signaling support required to move from need setting to actual implementation. And in terms of the broad investment context, we've heard the very challenging macroeconomic conditions that are currently prevailing across the world, but also the fact that there's quite a number of solutions that are available. They need a bit of a push to actually move into unknown or sort of incipient markets or regions. So as we were looking towards what should GCF do in GCF2, this is the context that we're being mindful of. With the second part, looking at what does this actually mean for GCF's vision. And for those that don't know, the long-term vision of the GCF as set out in initial strategic planning documents, it's in two parts. The first is to support developing countries implementing the Paris Agreement, and the second is to help developing countries drive paradigm shift towards low emission climate resilient development. And the first point of feedback we've heard through preliminary consultations is that this can actually be made a bit more actionable and make it a bit more practical in terms of what does this mean in reality and in the way GCF uses its resources. So there's a few opportunities there that I think we're putting again for your views and reactions. But in terms of paradigm shift and how does GCF do that, there's an opportunity to move more consistently towards systemic responses, addressing the systems transitions that I think the latest science is telling us we should help foster across energy, industry, society at large, urban and transport systems, as well as land, oceans, and ecosystems. The way we've started to think about that and conceptualize that in practice is through a theory of change that promotes, guides how we're planning to use resources and how we're currently guiding our programming around supporting countries to do this transformational planning and investment planning, focusing on innovation, on mobilization at scale, as well as aligning broader systems with the Paris goals. And one component of this is also defining a bit more GCF's risk appetite and how it relates to others. On the second part of how can we evolve and rethink the support provided to developing countries in implementing the Paris Agreement. And the starting point for this is obviously the national determined contributions, as that's the key national document guiding planning, but formally tie GCF support to this implementation planning of NDCs, NAPs, or long-term strategies to better help the translation of strategies into concrete interventions. We've heard quite a number of speakers sort of talking about this need to move from incremental to systemic approaches. What does this mean in practice? I think from operational experience, we've seen a lot of projects being identified individually and perhaps sometimes in isolation and being rethought of how can they incorporate climate into their design and how they can fit the NDC narrative. And the proposal here is to look at things the other way around, starting with the NDCs and NAPs or other climate strategies, to then conduct a more systemic analysis of what are the actual key priority interventions that would deliver the greatest impact within a given context. And it's within this approach of trying to move from incremental to systemic changes that we've had a first go at stepping out and mapping out the preliminary steps to guide NDC and NAP implementation and investment planning. And you'll probably be seeing this slide throughout the rest of the session because I think colleagues will try and deep dive into it into a bit more detail. But to begin with, it starts with once you have a national climate strategy, how do you move on through to identifying projects and what steps are being taken there? And some of the key gaps that we've noticed based on operational experience and country feedback is that there's a bit of a gap as well as an opportunity in conducting precisely that conscious systematic analysis across sectors and to use climate evidence on national vulnerability, risk, as well as emissions profile to identify the interventions that are most important or needed within a given country. With the second part that also has a bit more room for improvement is actually conducting an assessment of financial sources. So what financial source is most suited to address or to support a specific interventions. And this is what we're referring to when we refer to a financial engineering approach, which basically looks at, does an intervention need a policy change to be long lasting? Does it need financial de-risking to get the private sector to be involved? Is it that solutions are there, but they need other types of de-risking for them to be more scaled up? That's what we're referring to when we talk about financial engineering. So looking across the entirety of the value chain here of implementation planning and investment planning, we're seeing some opportunities here to strengthen that analytical component around evidence-based option identification, as well as strengthening support for doing this financial engineering approach to ensure that proposals that do come to the GCF are actually informed by this systemic thinking and analytical approach. So I think I'll pause here for this one, and then going back to audience feedback.
Great, thanks, Ramona. And I know there was a fair bit of content there, as Ramona mentioned. We'll be coming back to some of these ideas, particularly around the investment planning piece in the session tomorrow. But for the moment, it's time once again for your feedback. So we've again got 3 questions. There's actually 2 questions, but 3 slides this time around. We've tried to split it up. So the first is again an open-ended question. How can the GCF make its strategic vision more actionable for GCF2? So I think some of the early feedback we've got is that the vision is still relevant and ambitious. That is a vision to promote paradigm shift and support developing countries in implementing the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. But we may need to make it a bit more concrete and actionable with reference to the goals that the international community has set, as well as the other elements of our strategic plan. So please share your thoughts on how we might actually do that. So I see here predictable financing, tools of monitoring the projects, more support to DAEs, predictability in financing. Take country-specific actions quickly, building, capitalizing on the existing frameworks and strategies rather than creating a new one. So actually important to have some predictability and consistency there. Simplify programming so implementation can happen. Moving from planning to approvals and actions, that's definitely the spirit that we want to move in. Complementarity in programming policies, Rio conventions, focus areas linked to SDGs. Country level investment plans, taking better into account country contexts, theme coming through there, reference to net zero and resilience for people and territories. So a question of strengthening the ambition. There, DAEs coming through as a strong theme. More support for adaptation needs, promote, I think, establish project public-private, increase project levels. So the ambition of financing and predictability of financing, mobilizing more private finance, harmonization with the GEF, decentralization of GCF services with regional offices, more support to Africa. I'm trying to keep up as the screen scrolls down, but thanks, please keep the inputs coming. Tending to regional specific needs, for example, Central America, blending with domestic resources, domestic planning and budgeting processes, better connect operational guidance with the vision. So that internal alignment, support innovation and out of the box ideas like that one, capacitate NDAs, take into consideration changes in government as often. We need to have an opportunity to create projects while the institutional memory works. swiftness in project approval, complementarity and coherence. Again, great to see some common themes coming through there, which we can take up in action in our strategy setting. So we will move then on to the next question. This one asks you to respond on a sliding scale. So you'll respond to each statement, but from less important to more important. And the question is, how important is GCF support in the following areas to actually strengthen NDC, NAP, and LTS implementation and climate investment design? There are 3 statements on this slide, and then I think another 4 coming. So the first statement, how important are the following? Expanding availability of that downscaled or locally relevant climate information. Number 2 is conducting systemic climate risk vulnerability assessments and feasibility studies at that systemic level. And number 3 is building the capacity, expertise, and tools to actually utilize all of those assessments in decision-making, particularly around investments. So I'll give a minute more or so. I can see the number of responses clocking in there. And again, all of these can be very important, so you can feel free to rate all of them as highly or as lowly as you think is appropriate. Okay, I think I see people looking up at the screen and off their phones, so I'll give it 15 seconds more, and then we'll move to the next set of 4 statements. You can also move through Menti at your own pace. It will just give you a trigger to move to the presenter slide when you're ready. So the following same question. How important is GCF support in the following areas to strengthen NDC, NAP, LTS implementation and climate investment design? But 4 new statements to rate this time round. The first, how important is investment planning, including that exercise of actually finding and matching the financial sources and getting the financial structuring to actually attract and maximize the potential climate finance. Second, engaging your investment partners, including critically the private sector, not exclusively the private sector, but all the stakeholders that are involved in that investment process. Third is actually the drafting, the preparation of concept notes and funding proposals. And then finally, the actual process of updating your country plans and ambitions. That's updating the NDCs, NAPs, and long-term strategies. So they're the statements. Again, interesting to see the distributions coming through there. And we'll give it a minute or so more for you all to be able to provide your inputs in this question. In case of interest, the Menti shows the average on the numbers there, and then in the little mountains that you see behind, it's actually showing the distribution of responses. And again, a reminder that if you think something important is missing from this set of statements, please feel free to add that within the Q&A, either on Wova or on Menti. I'm watching my clock, but I see the bars have stopped moving so much, so I think that's a good sign for us to move on to part 3, where we'll zoom more into programming needs. So tag team out again, back to you, Ramona.
Thank you. So in this third part, we're looking at what kind of goals can GCF set for itself in GCF2. And this is quite a clear feedback we've been receiving through initial consultations on the strategic plan, that actually there is room to set some goals that can really link the vision, that high level long-term vision, through to programming and the actual operational activities of the GCF. You've seen Lillian present the latest status in terms of resourcing allocations across the current portfolio allocation targets. So programming is currently done across each replenishment cycle, and there are some allocation goals for what GCF's portfolio should look like at the end of GCF1 based on these targets. And there's goals around adaptation and mitigation balance and maintaining that balance over the long term. There's an impact goal to exceed the adaptation and the mitigation impacts of the IRM, the results of the IRM. There's an allocation parameter for the most vulnerable for SIDS, LDCs, and African states, also building on the IRM outcomes. There's a goal to increase funding channeled through the AEs, as well as to maximize the engagement of the private sector and the allocation that is being done through the private sector facility, with the last goal being to significantly increase mobilized private finance. So the discussion here is, are these the right types of goals, or are there other types of goals that the GCF can look at into GCF2, moving a bit beyond just the allocation component of it? And there's a preliminary framework for how to think of goal setting for the second replenishment. We've looked at other institutions, and there's quite a mix of institutional, long-term, mid-term replenishment cycle goals, both in terms of actual impact or more broader climate results goals. So there's three ways to potentially look at it. What midterm 2030 goals could the GCF set in GCF2? So for 2024, 2027, to better allow itself to track how it's supporting countries towards the 2030 goals under the Paris Agreement. Depending on what that looks like, it would then turn into the specific allocation targets, which means how will GCF2 resources, depending on the outcomes of the replenishment process, how will they be used in terms of those allocative parameters that I've just covered in the previous slides. And to then operationalize that, that could turn into operational targets to actually inform annual work planning and budgeting. In trying to look at what kind of goals we could explore, it's quite a new area for the GCF. We don't currently have that beyond the vision or the allocative targets. We looked at country needs. So what's the picture of needs that's portrayed there to sort of inform where it is that we could set some targets for ourselves. Colleagues have touched on the volume of the pipeline, a very big pipeline for the GCF through country programs, entity work programs, and the actual submissions of concept notes and funding proposals. We're seeing $40 billion there. And in terms of sectoral distribution, there's a higher proportion of adaptation needs in Africa, as well as a higher proportion of mitigation submissions in Eastern Europe and Asia. So in the spirit of putting questions back into the audience and what types of goals we could consider for GCF2, and again, do be mindful that this will inform our efforts to develop the strategic plan for B34. We've looked across 4 key themes. One is what goals can be set in terms of the support we provide to countries. Is there something that we can actually put our finger on and try and track throughout replenishment cycles on how we support countries and build countries' climate capacity? Do we want to look at not just funding channels through the AEs, but actually working with as many DAEs as possible? Because there's a difference between reconciling volume, but the number of institutions that we work with. The second component, adaptations, comes through a lot in the previous sessions. Do we want to increase the adaptation ambition beyond this 50-50 balance over time? And do we want to set specific goals around key sectors or transitions covering adaptation needs, like early warning system infrastructure, or something that's really even more focused on the most vulnerable? The second is how do we look at impact and on innovation? The current portfolio targets are focused on tons and beneficiaries delivered. Is there a broader scope for thinking of impact beyond the quantitative metrics? And can we think of goals around innovation or setting broader impact metrics in different systems transition areas? With the last question being the current private sector orientation of the targets looks at funding allocated for private sector, but also private sector mobilization. And is there a different way to actually quantify or track impact in terms of reaching private sector beyond mobilization, but also the range of actors that we work with? And there's been significant interest in how the GCF works or enables more direct links to domestic private sector actors. So this is the laying ground for questions. It's all questions here. And then actually moving back to, to the formal questions to get your feedback on these issues.
Thanks again, Ramona. So really key questions for us here as we're thinking about strategy is how can we use the strategy? How can we use our programming directions to really this time focus our ambition for action, our ambition to deliver results on the ground in terms of mitigation, adaptation, where it matters, and particularly for the people most affected by climate change. So again, it's time for your feedback. Hopefully you're getting used to the little colorful slide prompt here. We only have 2 questions this time, but they're rather big questions. So I'd like to give a bit more time for thinking through these ones. And the first area is trying to zoom into the programming needs, particularly your needs as our developing country partners. So you'll see within the Menti a selection basically of options here in terms of sectors and transitions. And we're asking you to provide your views on what are the most significant priority areas for programming for you in the coming 5 to 10 years. You can select up to 5 to force you a little on the question of prioritization, and you'll start to see the cumulative results pop up onto the screen. Once again, we have tried to synthesize the options here, both from the GCF results areas, from what we understand is happening in our programming at the moment, but also from the IPCC and latest advice on planning for systems transition. But if you again see anything missing from the options that you think is a critical omission, please pop that in the chat, either on WOVA or on Menti. And we wondered how this would go when we put this together. We didn't know how big the balls around each option would grow. So it's interesting to see this coming up on the screen. I think there's a very big concentration there around food, agriculture, water, energy nexus, ecosystems, the zero carbon energy transition, of course, resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, forests, ocean protection. So large bundles of priorities here. There we go. That's what Menti does when there's too many responses. It actually shrinks the bubbles, but which is nice to let us see the comparative prioritization across these programming areas. And of course, we do know that these programming areas are also country and context specific. So we will absolutely be taking those into account as we use this input. I see, oh, there's still dots coming in. So how about we give it another half a minute or so for people to complete their inputs. I'm watching the clock. I'll just give it 15 more seconds until we get to the even minute. But again, you can keep popping your answers in as we move to the next question if you'd like to add your views on this question of priority programming areas. And with that, we'll go to the second part of this section. And the question here is to prompt your thinking on programming goals and directions for the GCF. So what would be one or more, don't feel limited to one, what would be one or more meaningful, ambitious, and actionable programming goals that the GCF could set for this strategic plan for this programming period? And bearing in mind that that might be a goal for the next 4 years, it might be a goal for the midterm for 2030, it might even be a goal for longer. The idea just being to, again, focus that ambition for action and our ambition to deliver results with our partners. So I see here around DAEs, very key theme coming through this whole session, green energy transition, innovation, quicker programming, goals around quicker programming, dollar value finance, initiate zero emission targets, increasing the quantum of finance, loss and damage, under the green economy, secondary water use and reforestation, percent of funds reaching the local level, accrediting more DAEs, climate change impact on health program, at least 50% of adaptation finance to SIDS, more funding for adaptation, again, seeing a theme come through here around financing for adaptation, enhancing resilience, being closer to NDAs, acceleration of approvals. If you can frame them as quite specific goals, we're very happy to see those kinds of inputs as well. There's sort of a concrete one before on having, I think, funding approvals in less than a year. So if you want to put numbers in terms of ambition levels around any of the inputs here, you're more than welcome to. Improve impact to beneficiaries, agility for responding to urgent climate action, food and energy security, green transition, green economy, debt for climate, gaining more traction. Assist countries to set up GCF accredited national climate trust. I have to learn more about that one. I see loss and damage again, DAEs again coming through as a key theme. Loss and damage coming through a bit in this session, more funding for adaptation a couple of times on the screen there. Combination of appropriate technology and technical innovation, net zero and adaptation as goals, national climate plans, climate emergency response facility. Again, I'll just give it one more minute here because we really would like to collect all of your inputs on this question of goals. And do feel, feel empowered to be brave and put numbers on some of these things if you would like to see numbers on some of these things. So quicker approval and disbursement. Atolls greater focus, standardizing review. Decentralization of GCF, considering just transition approaches, development of more private sector climate finance funds like CRAFT, greater percentage of funds reaching most vulnerable and civil society organizations via EDA, fast track disbursements. Good to see some new ideas coming through in the group as well, promoting climate swap deals. We might leave this set there, but please again feel free to continue inputting as we move to our final part, which is on comparative advantage and complementarity and coherence. So Ramona, it's back to you for the final time.
Thank you very much again. So the last part touches on, I think, what was mentioned in the previous sessions, which is that the scale of need is very large, but that GCF is only one institution and there are other institutions out there within its very broad partnership network. So we want to test here what exactly is GCF's niche within this market, but also how can it work better better with others. To start off with, GCF's comparative advantage and putting a proposition again for testing is, first of all, it is the world's largest climate fund. So it's got a specific niche in terms of climate expertise. It's driven by a country-driven approach, which means that there's the largest, I think, support program offered for country capacity building. In terms of instruments, it's got a much broader range of instruments than other funds, but also a higher risk appetite, which means it can invest in areas that others may not, and it should take the opportunity to do so. With its very, very broad range of partners, from local national institutions at a smaller scale to perhaps larger multilateral institutions. It is a partnership institution. It works as a knowledge hub. It has the ability to gather and forge partnerships across this range of partners that it's already established through its previous 2 programming cycles. But the last point of comparative advantage here is that it's got this balanced investment approach between adaptation mitigation and quite a specific focus on the most vulnerable. We've tried to put GCF's features on a graph here, not trying to test your eyesight, but we've tried to look at where other key global players are operating. How many are focused on climate, which are focused mostly sort of on development or general investment. And we've looked across 2 key features, which is the scale at which they operate, but also the risk appetite and the range of instruments provided. And to give a very condensed interpretation of this graph, there's many ways, I guess, to look at it, is on the bottom right-hand side. I think as you're looking at it, we can see more conventional, traditional, both multilateral development banks, but also impact investors that maybe operate at a much larger scale than the GCF, but have a lower risk appetite. And then on the left-hand side, left upper side, we're seeing smaller institutions which are in the experimentation field, but often operate at a smaller scale. And we've sort of positioned GCF here to be somewhat in the middle, essentially facilitating the translation of solutions from the left-hand side, from those that are experimenting into the broader market. So a bit of a scaling market creation role. And one thing to conclude on opportunities for consolidating GCF's role as the hub of the climate finance architecture is working and consolidating this role of convening all partners around all the solutions that emerge from that country-led investment planning process, and making sure in the second part here that there's no real competition. So focus GCF support where it's actually most needed and most impactful, with the aim to crowd in and definitely not crowd out or duplicate what others are doing. And one last component of this that's been touched on previously is further harmonizing procedures, processes, and requirements with the other climate funds that often operate within the same space. So it's been a pleasure to introduce these. We'll move into the very last round of questions for this one. And we look forward to seeing how this further evolves in the next follow-up sessions in the next few days. So over to you, Selena, for the last round.
Thanks so much. That was the last part of the presentation. So if I can invite everyone to give a round of applause to Ramona for taking us through the presentation there, and some ideas, I guess, we've been having from the GCF side. So this last segment, I think, touches on that theme that also came out of the last session, where we really would sometimes like to do it all, but it is very difficult to be, I think the movie title is Everything Everywhere All of the Time. And that we can, perhaps by focusing on where our value add is best, but also on where we're best placed to actually work in complement with our partners to actually join forces, then that's where we can actually kind of refine our impact and focus our efforts and attention to have the most valuable results. So that's what we're focused on for this last part of your feedback. And we again have 2 questions coming to you on the Menti. The first is around our comparative advantages. Ramona just walked through this on the slide. Again, we're asking you to do a bit of a rating exercise here. So which do you think are the most valuable relative comparative advantages of the GCF based on what you see on your screens? And again, if you think that anything's missing, please feel free to add that in the Q&A. But the options we have there, which is reflected on the previous slide, our climate expertise and focus, country ownership and direct access, the range of instruments and risk appetite, ability to convene, being at the hub of this network of both accredited entity and delivery partners, and then of course, balanced funding to adaptation and mitigation and a focus on those particularly vulnerable to climate change. So I can see, interestingly, the order swapping around quite a bit as inputs go in. So I'll give it a minute or so more for everyone to be able to get their input in on this one. Seeing country ownership, just maybe nudge into a firmer position at the top there. Currently, country ownership and direct access, followed by adaptation, mitigation, balance, and focus on vulnerable, our climate expertise and focus, range of instruments and risk appetite, and then convening ability. And I'm seeing I think I'm seeing the graphs shift a little less and people looking up. So we will go to our final question. And I'm glad we've also been able to catch up some time and get you also closer to lunch. So this is it. This is what stands between everyone and lunch at this point, but please don't rush your way through it. The final question, how can GCF improve how it works with other climate funds, domestic and international public and private actors? So how can we actually improve the way we cooperate and engage through complementarity and coherence with others? This again is a free text answer, so please pop in whatever is on the top of your mind. So coordinate and generate synergies, avoiding too much overlapping, becoming fund of choice, aligning processes, make the team of GCF bigger, designated help desk for coordination, harmonize application processes, alignment of access requirements. And this does dovetail into the exercise you heard about in the last session, the work we're doing with Jeff on actually studying the alignment of our policies and processes, learning from experience and best practices of the adaptation fund, close follow-up with them, integrated work with the NDAs, particularly as you are working with multiple funds and partners, share minimal procedures, touching base and alignment, promote public-private partnership, country strategy actions jointly, document sharing, MOUs, seek for complementary options, improve coordination and cooperation, share best practices, avoid overlap in reviews. Some very, I think some common themes coming through here around both the harmonization of processes as well as strengthening cooperation, coordination, and working, of course, importantly at the country level to do so. So just give it another, I've got my eye on the clock, another 15 seconds to come through this one. Matchmaking, harmonize accreditation process and reports, listen to country priorities, simplify processes of Jeff based on GCF more modern view. We'll have to pass that on to our colleagues. Reducing complexity of accessing the funds, national program portfolio alignment. So with that, thank you so much for your input and interaction within this session. Hopefully you found it a useful and interesting insight into where we're thinking with the development of our strategic planning and programming directions for replenishment. We are absolutely going to find it useful, both the live input from today's session, but as we look through the more detailed input we'll have through the Menti tool. I see there are a couple of further comments that have been provided in the Q&A, but no direct questions. So I think with that, we can actually simply say that, again, thanks for your participation. We will have the opportunity, as mentioned before, for you to explore some of the themes raised today in more detail in some of the upcoming sessions. In particular, there's a session on systems transitions and programming coming up after lunch, as well as a session on engaging on the readiness strategy and how the delivery of readiness can be improved, happening later on this afternoon. But with that, I think I say thank you once again for your participation. This time I have to give a round of applause to all of you. And please a round of applause for each other. And we will then move into the lunch break. I have just one housekeeping announcement from the organizing team on lunch. I believe this announcement was made earlier, but just to reinforce. So because of our full capacity at the conference this morning and the importance for your safety of observing the social distancing requirements, we're inviting everyone to have lunch in different rooms. So there will actually be 3 lunch buffets set up, one outside this room and others outside the Sapphire and Emerald rooms, which are down the corridor a little in that direction. If you are able to split for social distancing and enjoy your lunch in those 3 separate rooms, we will then reconvene here for the afternoon sessions, I believe at 2 p.m., if I'm not mistaken. But with that, thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.